the reason that crying is so triggering to you is because when you cried, often, not always, but when you cried, your parents shamed you for that.
Welcome, everybody, to this week's episode of the Therapy4Dads Podcast. I'm very excited to have on, I say special guest, but everyone's special, if I'm honest. I say it every week. Everyone's a special guest. It's just a thing, because everyone is special. Everyone's unique, and I love everyone that I've met on this show. So far in this journey, it's been amazing. I've been able to work with and talk with incredible people with amazing things to say, with an array of life experiences. And without further ado, I'm welcoming Jon onto the podcast for the first time. So welcome, Jon. How you doing?
Hey, Travis. Yeah, super excited to be here. You may know me as @WholeParent on the social media. Whatever social media platform you're on, I'm probably there. And just glad to be here. I love talking, especially to dads. Dads have a special place in my heart.
Yeah, mine too. Hence the name of the show.
Yeah.
And I think that's how we found each other. I've done my best to, every time the algorithm has put people on in front of my page that I'm not following, especially when they're men or dads that I think are trying to achieve similar level of healing and reintegration and changing some of the dynamics, I immediately follow and reach out. And so I reached out to Jon, and we connected and talked, and kind of some kindred heart and some similar passions, and some, hey, we really want to help parents and dads. And so I'm like, I have to have him on the show because he's got some great things to say and some really good life experiences, and kind of doing what he's already doing and supporting the work he already is doing. And for those that are listening, if they need resources, it's like I like connecting people to, bridging them to things that are already out there that they may not know about. I think that's sometimes the difficulty. There's just so much out there. Where do I start? And trying to connect with some of these, creators and people who are doing amazing work already, who have done it. It's like, great, start here. Listen to the podcast. Here's a person to follow if you need it. Go check them out. They're already doing some great work. In a way, I've kind of done the vetting. So, this is I'm doing the vetting process here. So the whole interview process, if you don't know, I'm vetting them. They have no idea. It's a psychological vetting, and then I either don't release the show or I do. So we'll see if this gets aired. I'm not sure yet, depending on what Jon says.
I love it.
So I'm joking. So Jon, tell us a little bit about, and you're the whole parent, with a W, by the way, whole parent with a W. And it's going to be linked in the bio, everybody. Everything's going to be linked to his resources and his accounts. But can you tell us a little bit about why you started it, what you're about over at the Whole Parent?
Yeah. And by the way, Travis, I also am the Whole Parent, HOLE. I also have that account.
Okay,
Yes, I own that one.
Smart.
So if you're out there and you thought like, I'm gonna jump on this and I'm gonna like be fake Jon, not gonna work. I already own that one, and I think eventually when my life slows down, which maybe will be never, that one's going to be a parenting humor account.
Nice.
Yes. The whole parent. So. Yeah, my journey to being where I am right now is, it was I don't want to say it was a non-traditional path, but so many of us find ourselves in this space for different reasons and in different stages of life. And for me, I started the whole parent thing because I had gone through a parenting transformation myself. When we first had our first son, I didn't know. I mean, I think this is what kind of everyone finds themselves in. It's almost a universal experience, especially for dads, but I think for parents in general. You think that you know what it's going to be like. You don't know what it's going to be like. And I don't like the parents who are like, it's going to be so hard. It's going to be terrible. Like, don't hear me saying that, but you don't know what to expect. Like there are unique challenges in parenting, and especially in how you have to pre-process your own past and have to do your own work that are just unique to this parenting thing that we do. And so for me, I was in school and I was studying, it wasn't therapy, it was counseling. So I'm in school and I'm studying counseling and, how to counsel people, especially trauma-informed counseling and marriage and family counseling. And this is part of a larger degree, and we don't have to get into all of it. But
Sure.
I wasn't becoming a counselor, but I was studying these things. And just one day it just kind of clicked that the stuff that I was going home to a little human, and I was kind of totally forgetting everything that I was learning in class. There was like a fundamental, dissonance in my brain where the way that I was parenting was just the way that I was parented. And I always say on these podcasts, in case my mom is out there listening, I had a pretty good childhood. Like I really didn't, I don't have so many of the people who are doing parenting are like hashtag cycle breaker. Of course I'm breaking cycles, but I'm not breaking the same cycles that a lot of people are breaking. So, right. I had this experience of going home and realizing, hey, this is different, or this is, I'm not seeing my son the same way that I would see, a family that I was working with. And it just clicked in my head, man, there has to be a better way. And so I started just devouring books, and there's a whole subtext to subplot here where we were also becoming licensed foster parents. And that really through that process of trauma informed care. And
I bet.
A lot of the stuff about, a lot of my stuff that I talked today about, like anti-punishment stuff, which I'm sure we'll get into. But that stuff, a lot of it was coming from the foster care training from the state. So I'm getting this foster care training. I'm also getting this like child development, basic therapy, psychology, counseling type stuff. And then I'm also a new dad who's Googling, like, is my baby's poop supposed to be this color? Like, I'm doing the typical thing at the same time. Mm-hmm. And those three things came together, and it happened for me young. And then when my friends started having kids a couple of years down the road, because me and my wife got married pretty young and we started having kids pretty young. When it started happening for my friends a couple of years down the road, and they're going to their friends in kind of just the way that we do in society. And we say, hey, you commiserating or hey, what do you got advice for this? And I would give them these kind of thesis on what I thought about their child's problem. And they were like, dude, I was looking for like a 3-word answer and you gave me like a dissertation. So maybe you should be doing this. And so I started doing this on social media and just trying to kind of address some of the basic, how can we be effective parents? The basic stuff. And I don't want to say the rest is history, but all of my accounts took off because two things. Number one, this stuff really, really works. That's first and foremost. And number two, similar to kind of what we were talking about before, many people had never heard a guy say this stuff, right? That was the difference for I think I have the benefit of that very few men are you and me, Travis, talking about this stuff. It's and I was able to connect with a lot of women's husbands. That was a big piece. Hey, I send my husband your videos, and so that was a piece of it. So that's how I'm where I am today and doing this parenting thing.
And I like what you said. It sounds like you got like the trifecta of training. Trauma informed from foster, which that's a whole training of itself, and then just basic developmental training of brain development and early childhood development, and then just becoming a dad and just learning just in the fire of being a parent, trial by fire. So, sink or swim situation, which all parents go through. Boots on the ground. Yeah, boots on the ground. And I think to some degree, myself included as a trained clinician, trained therapist, like I know a lot of this stuff already, but just to like kind of say yes to what you said is, even then, there's still things I didn't know. I was still Googling things. The poop thing, absolutely, I did that. Like, are they breathing? Are they not breathing? Because I knew stuff, but there's still stuff I don't know. Because and each kid, so right, each kid is so unique. Now, there are foundational things that I fully believe in that every kid should have regardless.
Sure.
But each kid is unique, and sometimes you have to adjust, and I'm sure we'll get into that in this podcast with effective parenting, since that's the topic of today, effective parenting and the shift or the growth, so to speak, out of what we just called earlier in the green room, ineffective parenting, or maybe old school parenting, or maybe not as informed parenting, or traditional
parenting.
And I would say probably some of that is probably based on what they knew back then.
Oh,
right, because
absolutely.
there's things 50, 60 years ago that said this is what you should do to a child, and that was taught by people with PhDs and doctors and the people that were trying to teach it. And now it's like, with the new information we have now with brain scan imaging and all this other stuff, we now know actually that was not helpful. Some of it, fine, but there's a lot of it that actually caused more pain, trauma, insecurity, things like that.
Yes.
And so today we're looking at effective parenting and your journey of becoming a dad, learn these things, understanding trauma, and saying, wait a second, hold on. Maybe some of the stuff in which I was parented, my parents probably did the best they could. Hi, Mom. Hi, John's mom. Did the best they could with the tools they had. And the reason why I say is because I've talked to my dad recently. We've been talking for a little while now. We didn't talk for about 3 or 4 years. That's a different story. But now we're talking, and we've had some really amazing, really deep conversations. And he was like, Trav, he's like, you guys, what you're doing, he's, you're so far ahead of what I knew then. We didn't know this was not, he's like, we didn't talk, this was not, no one talked about this back then. No one talked about it. And it wasn't, he wasn't saying like an excuse, but it was more of an acknowledgement of reality of what he came out of, and his parents being baby boomers and like what they were, and just, this was not discussed. So he's like, you guys, you learn, he's like, you know more than I did, not even close at your age. He's like, I'm still learning this stuff now at my age at 60 something. He's like, you know this. I'm like 30, 30 years old, and I'm just now learning this stuff. Right. So there is something where we look at the generations previous, and we can acknowledge, hey, they probably did the best, generally speaking, with the tools they had, and some of those tools were ineffective and not even helpful. And now we're doing things differently.
Well, I think we're the first generation of parents who could parent differently in this way. Yeah. Like, I think that this is definitely something that I've had to process with many people who I work with. Is that, I don't want to completely go down the path of your parents did the best they could with what they had. Like, I think that's a little bit of an overused, right? Like, I think we all. And
I'm generalizing here because I work with a lot of trauma and stuff that was not the best.
Was not the best that they could, right?
Absolutely, and I'm a generally statement here.
For sure, no, and I say this too. Like, I use it a lot, but I also think there's another piece to this, which is that goes a little bit deeper to that I don't just say, like, I think that you were getting at this. It's not just they were doing the best they could with what they had. They were also maybe doing the best they could with what was available. Like, there's a whole second conversation to be had about, well, disproportionate poverty and marginalized communities, and is this research even available to them, and is it accessible, and are we doing this well, right? But there's another piece of this where, like you said, PhDs and doctors in 1989 are giving people, so this is the example that I use all the time. We've known, basically prior to 1990, we knew effectively nothing about the brain. We knew about psychology.
Yep.
Right? But we knew effectively nothing about the brain in comparison. That's why they call the 90s the decade of the brain. Like, we didn't really know anything about the brain. And a great example of this, it's not exactly this, but similar, is that, the established medical treatment, 1985, not a long time ago. I mean, a lot of people who are parents right now in my membership were born in 1985. The established medical treatment for Braxton Hicks contractions in 1985 was IV alcohol. That was how you stopped Braxton Hicks contractions. The idea, like, when people hear that, like, oh my God, what about fetal alcohol syndrome? Like, they weren't even not even thinking along those lines, right? And this is not a million years ago. This is 40 years ago that this is the real, world that we're living in. So just understanding that that's the first thing that we have to acknowledge, and is that when we talk about effective parenting, we can't hold boomers and even early Gen Xers to the standard that we hold ourselves to today. Yeah. And we can talk about why effective parenting is so important with the teen mental health crisis. But we can't hold them to the same standard in the same way that you can't hold somebody from 1,000 years ago to the same standard of patriarchal
It's context. You need
views.
You need context. Yeah, you need context, because without if you remove context, you have to look at the time and the day and the place to better understand something. And even someone in my office, like if I have a person in my office, I really have to know everyone's particular context and culture that they're from, their family culture, their ethnic culture, and I can't apply that to every single person because there's going to be some nuance, even present day, right? So I have to, you're right, we have to take context. We can't remove it, because if we remove it, then that's misinformation. That's actually a fallacy. And then you're looking at them not from the correct lens. It's like, no, you're right. They didn't have this accessible. In fact, because like you said, what was accessible was that IV alcohol. That was the treatment. So you're like, oh, I'm being told this is I'm going to do the very thing that what is told, right? Right. Or spanking was a big thing back then. Strict and punishment. Or back then, I'm thinking of kids, leave them alone, right? I mean, this was taught. Do not touch them.
90s. I mean, the 90s is the decade of leave your kid alone when they're crying, because you're going to give them too much attention.
Don't touch them. Yeah, you'll spoil them, right? Don't touch them, right? All these things, but we know that not right now. And we know that what we teach now, that's actually creating more trauma in the brain and disconnection and and these kids now have to become hyper independent and not rely on people, and they develop different insecure attachment styles because of this. And so, but that's what was taught. And so you're right. Today we have a plethora of knowledge, we have a plethora of information, but we're still healing, and that's going to take time.
Well, and I think that I think part of our healing has to be a real acknowledgement of that, I think that part of the healing process, the more I go into this work, and the more, and you're going to, yes, amen this, but the more I go into this work and dig deep into this, the more I realize that all of the tips and tricks and hacks, like these things, without a deep sense of doing your own work and actually reprocessing your own childhood, are Band-Aids on a gaping wound. If you're using the stuff on my account, the stuff that you hear on this podcast, to get your kid to repress their emotions and not actually trust themselves, and ultimately to just be compliant and obedient at all costs, right? Like if that's your end goal, like you could use the stuff that I say to do that, but you're not going to have great, amazing relationships long-term with your kid. You're not going to foster healthy emotional, physical, mental well-being, relational well-being with your child if that's your ultimate goal. And so, as we talk about effective parenting, which we should probably get into, but like as we talk about what this is, like we can't divorce that. Like the first step is always in.
Yeah.
The first step is always looking back at what happened to me. And why am I reacting in this way?
Well, let's jump in. That's the first step, right? I mean, I think it's good to have, we were laying some context, everybody, laying some groundwork for, why effective parenting. And the first step is effective parenting sounds like is looking inward. Why am I reacting, right? Is that the first step of your model? Well,
yeah, I think if you asked me what the whole parent method is, people keep trying to nail this down. Like, okay, so like, what's the process? And really, I mean, I'm such a nuance-driven person that I'm like, well, the process is different for everyone. What people want 3 easy steps, right? So I think if you want the 3 easy steps, it's number one, you have to like shift your mindset. You have to reframe the paradigm of what is my goal in parenting. Like, is my goal ease? Like, is my goal doing less work as a parent? Which, by the way, if you're a new parent, if you're listening to this and your kid is 6 weeks old and you're like, am I ever going to go to another movie again? Yes, you will. But like, it's going to be some time, right? Like, I understand the immediate, your freedom, there is a loss of freedom when in parenting, when you're another human is you're responsible for another human.
Right.
And so I understand why people want to, that, but if that's your ultimate goal is to be free of your kids, this is the people who say things like, man, just can't wait till they're 18 when they're like 18 months old.
Yeah.
If that's your ultimate goal out of parenting, like you're going to be supremely disappointed at the end of your life. And I think big piece of this too is my primary counseling environment that I worked was as a chaplain at a hospital with people who were dying. Specifically, I worked at one hospital where the average age at this hospital was probably 75 or 80. And this hospital, it was all geriatric patients because it was part of a hospital system where if anybody was over 80, they just sent them to this one hospital. And so I'm sitting with all these people who are dying, and they're people who parented their kids, with the belt, and they parented their kids with the, with a voice or, whatever, the obedience, compliance, this whole model. And like, not a single one of them was like, man, I really did a good job with my kids. And I am so grateful that I took out my frustration on them physically. Every single one of them was like, man, I could have been gentler, and I should have been.
Yeah.
And so understanding, I don't remember if this is a Dan Siegel and Tina Payne Brysonism or who this is, but you start with the end in mind. If you start with the end goal in mind of like, what am I actually trying to achieve? And then, so if that's really step one, is thinking about what your actual goals are for your kid and what you want your kid to be, not when they're 18, this is another big one, but when they're 38. So I like to tell parents, stop focusing on how your kid's going to be at 18, because they say, well, I want my kid to get into Harvard. I want him to play football for Ohio State, or I want him to do this or that. I want him to get married to a beautiful person or whatever. I want them to have a great first job. At 38, when they're engrossed in their career, what do you want them to do? Right? So starting with the end in mind, right? So start at 38. Your child's been doing their career for at this point, let's say 20 years. or maybe
Yeah.
15. They've reached the pinnacle. They have the corner office. Now what? How do you want them to feel? Well, I want my child to feel a sense that they go to work every day and that they're doing something good for the world. I want my child to have a loving and supportive family. Okay, now these are real goals. Let's those are real goals. Like let's talk about because from 38 to 88, that's all. Like those goals aren't going to change very much. Up until 38, your goals are going to change a lot, or maybe until 28, your goals are going to change a lot. At 38, they're pretty locked in. Your goals are like, that's where I start. So start with the end in mind. Number one. Number two, now understand that if there's an opposite of effective parenting, it's factory default parenting. This is what I forgot. I forgot to say this before. I had it in my mind, but I was like, I do call this something. Factory default parenting is...
It's okay, dad brain. Dad brain.
It's dad brain. I'm still thinking about my kids. They're downstairs. So factory default parenting. Now, step 2 is to go back into your past and go, what is my factory default parenting and why is it that way?
Yeah, great question. Yeah.
Why am I triggered by crying? And people are like, I just don't like the sound of it. And I'm like...
Yeah, but why?
Yeah, okay, but exactly. What? But is it because...
Yeah.
And it's really interesting, even with people who are on the reparenting journey. I was just on a podcast a couple weeks ago, and I was talking to a mom who's on the reparenting journey. And I was like, I pointed something out that was a very kind of plainly visible in the story that she was telling. She's like, no, I don't think that's it. And like 5 minutes later, she's like, no, that was 100% it. Like our initial reaction to uncovering our own factory default settings is to rejection. So number 1, start with the goal. Number 2, do your own work. And then number 3, now that you're, for lack of a better term, conscious parenting, you're thinking about your parenting and you're thinking about what you actually want from your family and your children. Now let's go forward and let's go into the strategies and what I call the tools of effective parenting.
No, I love it. I think that and I know it's nuanced, but generally speaking, that those 3 steps are so important of, what is my default, why, and what is my end goal and what are my real goals, not just the Harvard, but how do I want them to be? What kind of person, right? That's like real, because that's really what we're aiming at, or we need to be aiming at, because that helps us get there versus the Harvard or the play ball. It's like, wow, those are important, but you're getting to a much deeper meaning, and also coming from your experience of meeting with these dying individuals and hearing these stories time and time and time and time again, themes of, wow, I could have been more loving, could have said it, I could have worked less, I could have been more. It's often the same stuff. It's like, I could have been there, could have said it more, I didn't need to work as much. It's really about relationship, and that's where you're getting at.
We're very complicated people. Human beings are very complicated, and at the same time, we're not that complicated.
Correct.
Like at the same time, like people said the same thing over and over and over. And I understand they were coming from a given context, right? Maybe if I was, then, uprooted myself and moved to the Congo or moved to China or moved to South America somewhere, maybe I would have gotten different responses. But at least in North America, in suburban Chicago, I mean, people had all sorts of different backgrounds. Universally, it was either I have a good relationship with my kids and it's the greatest achievement of my life, or I don't have a great relationship with my kids and it's the greatest regret of my life.
And I think that's universal. I would say that's universal from authors I've read that have worked with people groups from different countries and nationalities and cultures. I'd say there's definitely a universal connection there, right? Because we're relational beings, so there's definitely that universal connection. Yeah, for sure. There's got to be some universality to it. But certainly with the context of what was in the way. Right.
What was in the way was either I was too hard on my kids or I was too absent. Like there was never I was just too permissive, which I understand. You can't can't, I'm not saying that you can't be too permissive, but the only permissiveness, if you really want to know, the only permissiveness that I've ever heard a grown-up child complain about in their parents was the permitting of another person in their life to continue to hurt them. Like if you were so conflict avoidant that you as the parent did not intervene with the other parent's abuse or with another family member's abuse, sure, that's the type of permissiveness that I'm worried about. Like that's am I a permissive parent? Are you believing adults more than you believe your child when they're telling you that there's something going on? That's the permissiveness that I would say we gotta nip. But the kind of thing that you hear on, I hate to say this, but from the Gen X, especially generation of like, these kids just do whatever they want these days. And these kids the parents just let them get away with anything. Like, yeah, I'm still waiting to find the people for whom that was the great sin in their life that caused them to be really messed up psychologically,
Mm-hmm. And thinking of some of the themes when you hear of this kind of introspection of the parents that you've heard, you could generalize this, of course, but what are some of those themes you've seen or heard reported when the default parenting piece? I think that's a thing a lot of us can get stuck in. So what are some of those themes of those parents that have gone through your program and they're like, whoa, those like aha moments as to why they're stuck in the default parent mode? What are some of the big ones that you see time and time and time and time again?
Yeah. So I'm actually thinking, I'm kind of playing around with the idea of writing about this someday, but I think that it comes down to a set of myths, really. So the default parenting primarily are actions that are grounded in a certain, and I'm going to use this word maybe in a way that your listeners haven't heard, but a certain mythology that they believe, right? So I was addressing this.
Yeah, tell me more.
I was addressing this with a 75-year-old woman yesterday, literally. So sitting at lunch with a 75-year-old woman yesterday, or she might be older than that. And she was like, do you actually think, so we were talking about my son actually and my parenting. And I said, oh, well, you'll never see me correct my son in front of you. You'll never see me punish, discipline, consequences in front of you, yell at him in front of you. And she was like, why? And I said, because anything he's doing in that moment, it's ineffective, not effective parenting, to engage him in the moment of dysfunction. Always more effective to re-engage later. And she just spit the myth out, right? She said, you're telling me that 3 hours later, your 6-year-old is going to be able to remember what happened? I'm like, I'm telling you that 3 months later, my 6-year-old will be able to remember what happened. Now, not every kid is like that, but 3 hours later, every kid that is verbal, who has neurotypical cognition, is going to be able to readdress something that happened later down the road. But this myth that the kids are like dogs, and if you don't discipline them in the moment of dysfunction, then you didn't do anything, or you don't yell at them when they're doing something wrong, then they'll just keep doing it. That's a myth.
Yeah.
So,
and that also goes into how you define discipline.
Sure.
Right. That's a thing, right? Because, how is she thinking? What does discipline mean versus what you mean by discipline?
Well, right. And it's a generational gap. So she raised her kids. Right. She raised her kids in the probably 70s and 80s. And so her kids who were raised in the 70s and 80s are like, she's like, you don't do any spankings, do you? And I'm like, no, I don't. And she's like, oh, so you just got to give them those constant timeouts. And I was like, no, I actually don't give my kids timeouts. I actually don't punish them at all for anything. And she was like, what? What do you mean you can't? What do you mean you don't punish them? And I said, well, I'm trying to teach them. I'm not trying to hurt them. I'm not. Well, and I don't want to say punishment is always hurting, but I'm not trying to de-incentivize the action. I'm trying to educate around the behavior. And I'm trying to get to here's another myth. Behavior is never the problem. Behavior is always the symptom of the problem. Your kid's behavior, maybe it's like a habit. They chew on their shirt, and then the behavior might be the problem because it's habitual and they have a compulsiveness to it. But with actual relational stuff, the behavior is never the problem. The behavior is always the iceberg underneath, right? That's what's going on. And so you want to discipline, you have to educate. This is what discipline means. And for Western history, let's just say the last 200 years of Western history for this context. For the last 200 years of Western history until about 20 years ago, the idea was the only way to educate is to cause discomfort. De-incentivize through discomfort. We now know that that's pretty ineffective. It's ineffective with kids. It's ineffective with adults. The more harshly you punish someone does not change whether they will commit a crime or not. If the speeding ticket is $800 or it's $100 or if it's $2,000, people speed at the same rate. If you lock somebody up on a third strike drug offense for 45 years or life sentence, versus a fine, there's no decrease in the amount of illegal drug sales and use. punishment is not a good teacher. It's just not. So at what point are we going to start parenting effectively and actually working within a system that's about retribution and it's about education, which, by the way, in those environments, the way that you can stop somebody from speeding, education. The way that you can stop somebody from reoffending who's incarcerated, education. That's really what it is. This is how humans developed and learn. We learn through education. We don't learn by punishment. And there's reasons in the brain why that doesn't work. But suffice to say, if you're willing to believe Travis and I, it doesn't work.
Yeah. Yeah, it doesn't. And some of that too, I would add with some of those things is we got to also do some healing too, healing some old wounds, some old myths, and because I think what Jon's on to and is really when you ask that why question, why am I doing this? Why am I parenting this way? Why am I, what is my mode of defaulting or yelling or, crying pisses me off, I scream, or I spank, like where is it coming from? And often it's our own hurt and pain and wound anyway,
Right.
Often, generally speaking, it's often our own stuff, our own fear of control or fear of something bad happening or why we think we deserve it or they deserve it or, whatever it is, often from our own pain and hurt. And so that's we got to go through our own healing process, like you said, is a big part of being an effective parent is also doing your own work, right? So can you tell us a bit more about that, doing your own work?
Yeah. I think a big piece of this is, one, I mean, there's the multiple layers of this, right? So the first layer is, me making a TikTok video or something that says, yelling is selfish because yelling is about getting your aggression out, not about educating your kid, right? So like that's like the first level of just, okay, recognizing that so many of the punishments or I guess just parenting moments that I regret had way more to do with where I was and way less to do with where my kid was in that moment. So that's number one. The deeper level is when you get into the spanking and the physical, the stuff that in many of the circles that I run in, we would now say is abuse. When you get into the abusive, which by the way, extreme timeouts, extreme cold shouldering, this is emotional abuse. So, probably the thing that blew me up initially more than anything else on TikTok was when I made a video about how there was this dad who was making his daughter smash her own cell phone because she had been disrespectful to him on her phone, and he made her smash it with a hammer, and she was clearly in great distress. And I said, that's abuse. And it's not abuse because of what he's doing. It's abuse because he's not stopping when she is in this state, right?
Right. So she's not helping her regulate herself, right? She's more dysregulated.
Right. She's this 12-year-old kid, and she is like, you're watching a person be traumatized, right? And I don't care what it is, whatever it is, right?
Yeah.
For some kids, you look at them the wrong way, and that's enough.
Oh yeah, I think of my two boys, very different.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I got
very
one like
different.
That too. Yeah. Yeah.
I have to approach them. There's definitely a similar base, but I have to approach them differently because definitely my second has that more emotional, again, by look, he takes that. That's like everything. Like it hits him differently. My oldest he's more in his head. So it's like, okay, whatever, whatever, Dad, so I have to reach him differently. So you have to think each person's unique and how are they picking up and what are they reading? How are they picking up the energy, my energy,
right.
Of the room, of the world around them. So yeah.
Right. Yeah. Well, and so when we get into these, whatever you want to classify as abuse, when we get into abuse, at this point, we're talking about really disorganized memories. And the process of actually, it's hard to even call them memories, right? Because they're just fragments and intrusions into our psyche. And sometimes it's not even explicit. Sometimes it's implicit. We don't even remember what happened, but we know how it made us feel. And so what happens then is that we have to start, well, I banged my microphone here. We have to start to actively, I'm trying to think of the right word for this. We have to think very critically now about these things, because the natural default way that many humans, if not most Western thinkers, will organize a disorganized memory, which includes, by the way, their primary caregiver, which they feel like this person loved me. That has to be a fundamental principle of most of our lives, is that our parents loved us. Like if if our parents love us and they also hurt us, and that creates this great dissonance and disorganization, then we have to justify our parents' actions. And so one of the fundamental reparenting type work things that I do is, hey, how are you justifying what your parents did to you? Because whatever you can justify your parents doing to you, you will be able to justify doing to your kid. If you think, hey, I deserved it, or it made me the person I am, or I'm better for it. I was a snot-nosed little kid and now I'm better for it. Mm-hmm. If you're able to do those mental gymnastics in order to come to a place of baseline where you're not actively being traumatized, I mean, this is a coping strategy. It's subconscious, but it's a coping strategy. If you're getting to that point, then we have to deconstruct that, because if you think that being hit made you a better person, it will always be within your power to hit your kids. It will always be there at the back of your mind going, maybe they need it too. If you think that your parents yelling at you straightened you out, it will always be in the subtext of your mind. Maybe sometimes it's okay to yell at your kids, or it's good to yell at your kids.
Yeah. And it's funny, not funny. I think what you're saying is so important, because a lot of the work that I do with trauma and attachment, wound healing, deficits, things that, a lot of shame, a lot of these things that we go back to, whether it's implied or explicit, intentional, unintentional, when I'm sitting with them and I'm in the place and I go back and kind of ask these questions, like when maybe they're in some level of distress and their parents were yelling. And these give me good intentioned parents who for the most part were fine, but they have these moments. This is a memory though of like, there's this sense of shame, like I wasn't enough, or I was somehow bad, or I'm a failure. So we internalize this message of like, well, that's why I'm being yelled at. And so then I'm deserving of this later because, and they even do it themselves, by the way, when they're adults, like 38 now.
Oh yeah.
They do that. They have that internal critical voice of any time something goes wrong. It's like, well, because I'm bad, I'm deserving.
I'm
it's
stupid.
a tape that plays.
I'm just so stupid. I mean, how many people do you work with, right? And their default when they make a mistake is, I'm so stupid.
I'm stupid, or I'm not enough, or I'm worthless, or I'm a failure. I mean, it's to every, and when I
that's
go
my
back
internal
to those
voice.
Places,
I mean, that's my intro. Like that's the work that I'm doing currently. I mean, it's a real thing.
Yeah, no, and mine was I was not enough. And I had to work through that in my own therapy. But when I sit with these people and I get to that soft place and I'm able to kind of get there with them, 99.99999% of the time is not that they didn't need yelling, they didn't need a spanking, they didn't need to be put in the room, they needed someone to hug them.
They needed connection.
Yeah, they needed connection. They needed comfort. They needed attunement. Someone to say, you're okay. I'm here. I'm not leaving you. I know you're having a hard time. Because it's like built, it's wired into us. That's what we need.
Yep.
But then what we learn though along the way is that, well, I can't really trust this. So I have to kind of shut that part off of myself and like not need these things. Yeah. And tell myself, well, it's because I'm not enough, right? So because we have to make sense. It's part of our brain of survival is like, well, we do what we got to do to survive. In some ways we do that, by the way, is by blaming ourselves for the problem, because that's the only thing we can do to cope.
Right. I'm like jumping in here because it's super exciting to me to talk about this stuff, because this is another one of the myths, right? Independence. That independence is somehow a goal. One of the things, now this is one that I will get at 38. Well, I want my child to be independent. And I'm like, really? You're hoping that they don't need other people and that they're so fiercely independent that they don't rely on anyone for anything? Yes. Okay. Like,
where's that come from?
Yeah, let's talk about that.
There's a story there.
Let's talk about that because none of us, like when you have a hard day, you go home to the people who care about you, whether that's a spouse or whether that's a trusted friend or colleague or your parents still, even as an adult. Like you go back to the people with whom you are safe. And that's not a bad thing. That's actually a good thing. That is a good way of processing. Like there are so many worse ways of coping with disappointment and harm and hurt and having a bad day and not getting the promotion at work that you wanted to get, or the breakup that you just went through, or the loss of a parent. Like there are so many worse, more destructive ways to go through this than to lean on people who love you. But yet one of the myths is, hey, I want my child to self-soothe. And we talk about this in sleep training or in, at nighttime, but really where this falls into the greatest issue is I'm going to ignore you when you're crying because I want to teach you how to self-soothe. Instead of teaching kids how to cope, and coping oftentimes as an adult looks like processing with a trusted person. And by the way, your child's brain is not developed enough to cope on their own anyway. So
they need us.
Yeah, you're just putting them in a supremely, destructive
you're putting them in
cycle.
distress. Yeah. You're putting them in outside. This is a Dan Siegel term, outside of their window of tolerance, right?
Sure.
Because they need us to regulate because their brain's not developed yet. So you're right. We need Sue Johnson coined this term. She's a Canadian psychologist, developed emotion-focused couples therapy. She said, I like how she coined it. She doesn't believe in codependence. I don't actually like the term either, being a codependent, because I think that's the fear, right? Is I don't want to be codependent. I want to be hyper-independent. She calls it an unhealthy dependence.
Yep.
Versus actually what we need is a healthy interdependence that which goes to attachment. If I have securely based with my family, caregiver, my spouse, my friends, I know I can come and be connected and attuned and co-regulate. I have a hard day, I can come to my spouse or my whatever and talk about it, or my good buddies. I could phone a buddy up, say, dude, I had a rough day, can we talk? You're able to kind of regulate with their nervous system, which helps you calm down.
Right.
But then you're also able to go explore the world, right? It's all about attachment. Because if I feel safe here, I could actually go venture out into the world knowing I have a safe haven to come back to. Right. So it's this sense of healthy reliance on one another, but it's balanced, right? Because it's if we swing the pendulum one or the other ways, it's unhealthy independence, where it's like emotionally numb and cut off, which leads to things like depression and panic and a whole bunch of things I see in my office all the time, is people who are independent, but they have no connections, no relationships, especially men who are dying inside because they don't have no one to turn to and talk to.
Right.
Or you become, the term that's used is the codependent, which is really an unhealthy dependence where you lose your identity in the other person because you're afraid of being alone. And so I do whatever I got to do. So either way, what you're teaching your kid, going back to the effective parenting, is what I see you're doing is helping parents teach their kids to have a healthy dependence on each other, which enables them to actually go out in the world and explore, which enables them to better regulate their emotions, because the reality is, my wife is not always with me 24/7. So as an adult, you do get to the place of being able to cope on your own, but also knowing I can turn to her when I need her, right? That's the point. We need a community as well as ourselves. It's not that she's regulating me, but I go to her when I need to, and we rely on each other or a friend, because then you're equipping your 38-year-old to be able to do that when they had a hard day at work.
Yes.
They have their why of like, here's what I'm doing. I had a rough day, and I'm not going and turning to the bottle and drinking my sorrows away, or numbing out on TikTok, and just, I'm able to like talk with people and and regulate myself and healthily be effective. And then to my kids, like, so there's this, what you're doing, what I'm seeing is you're really building for the next generation, for the generations to come, that they're going to be better equipped for their kids. Healthy interdependence, where they're more conscious parenting, not being stuck in default. And maybe their default then, maybe that'll be the new term. Maybe default parenting then will be actually conscious parenting. Parenting,
I mean, we can hope.
Maybe that'll be the new one.
So here's a term that I'm beta testing. I don't think I've ever said that on another podcast, but the term that I'm starting to play around with using is intradependence. So it's not a real word. We're making it up as we go along here. But that's okay. We're on the cutting edge of parenting, right? So interdependence is the space between us. International, right, is like the space between two nations. Intradependence is, I know that I can go outside of myself for what I need. I also know that I can go inside of myself for what I need. Like, I am enough, but also we are enough at the same time. And that we can actually get to this point of like oscillating as is necessary back and forth between what we need at any given time, which may look like I don't scroll TikTok while I'm driving on the interstate on the way home because I cannot be alone with my feelings and wind up wrapping my car around a pole. But also means I also know that there are safe people. There is a safe haven. And I think that this is one of, a lot of people are like, okay, Jon, give me the basics. How do I not mess my kid up? Right? Like, I don't want to go do all this self-work. My dad was an alcoholic. I don't want to deal with it. And I'm like, oh, that's really sad that you don't want to deal with it. But okay, fine. You want the basics? Like, just make sure that your child knows that they're always safe at home and they belong. If you can do that, 95%, we're gonna run into some problems. But if 50, and I say you don't even have to do this 100% of the time. if 70% of the time you interact with your child in a way that reinforces that they belong and that they are accepted, regardless of what they do, that they're unconditionally accepted, if you can do that, you're probably going to do a pretty good job, period. Like if you need like the Cliff Notes version, if you can just do that, you're going to raise a child who at least has the basis of resilience to be able to foster that later for themselves. If they don't grow up feeling like they have a place to go with their big feelings, then you will see what we are seeing, which through the birth of the internet. The internet is not, Dave Chappelle does a great sketch, The Internet's a Place, right? But the truth is the internet is not a place. And the same is true. Your relationships on the internet are relationships, but not in the same way. And so, with the birth of social media and the internet, with all of the amazing connection, and obviously, me and you are sitting here today, Travis, because of the internet on opposite sides of the country, right? There's good in this, but at the same time, the internet will never be a replacement for a stable family home. And the more kids think that they can replace their unstable family environment with some sort of arbitrary Instagram community, says the guy who intentionally tries to foster intentional Instagram communities. Like, the more you think that that's going to replace it, the more you're going to realize that it's an empty bucket. Or it's a bucket with a hole in it. You keep pouring in and it just keeps coming out. And so, that's the basis, right? If you're like, I can't get with you on the punishment stuff, Jon, I got to use punishment sometime. I'm still going to yell at my kids. Okay. First of all, me too.
Well, I'm going to give you a book for you to read on science, but okay. Yeah.
Right.
I say, you're going to read this. If you want to see me again, read this book. And,
right. But if they go to the point of like, I can't do it. I can't get to that point with you. If really at the core, your kid feels accepted and loved unconditionally.
Totally. Yeah.
Like the rest of it is cheese on the nachos, right?
Yeah.
And so that's the, the basis of effective parenting is raising a kid who actually grows up to feel secure. And in order to do that, you have to be secure.
Yeah. Well, I think it comes back to, as we start to wrap up, is the reality is it's going to require some level of your own work, whether you do it as you realize what your kid needs in a way you're reparenting yourself. That can happen as you start to do things differently of like, wow, I didn't get this, but I know somehow deep inside, I know my kid needs this. And I've seen this happen where I've seen people come from horrific backgrounds, but give their kids really what they needed: love, affection, care, support, love, like not even close to what was given them.
Right.
But they didn't have a grid for it, but they knew somewhere deep down that, no, my kid needs love, affection, not to be hit or whatever.
Right.
I'm not doing that. That I know that's wrong. And they're able to give that space of love, affection, and you belong here because they know that they didn't get that. And so sometimes it's possible. And I think even through their reparenting, in a way, they kind of reparent their own inner child, like that wounded self. And that can be very healing. Other times it does require work, especially I'm thinking of dads right now, being on a dad podcast, or men, is that, man, if you're shutting your boy's emotions, because you were told to shut him down, he's going to be very similar to how you're struggling right now, because he's going to hear that he can't feel. And so I think if I challenge guys, I'm going to challenge you men, we got to be comfortable with emotions. We got to learn to be comfortable in our body, and to teach our boys and our girls the same. But I know a lot of men come into this because it wasn't safe. Right. They were told not to feel. And so I think for that, they have to do some work in order to be present for their kids' emotions, because what's going to happen for them is they're going to go right back into their survival states of, well, this is a threat, this is a danger for me, so I got to shut this down somehow, whether yelling or go to your room or whatever, because I can't handle this. Right.
Well, it's an implicit memory usually. So what we get into, and I this, but just to say it for anybody who hasn't heard this, especially the guys, the reason that crying is so triggering to you is because when you cried, often, not always, but when you cried, your parents shamed you for that in one way or another. Boys don't cry. Whatever. They just turned a shoulder to you. They ignored you. Whatever. Right.
Yeah.
When you cried, your parents shamed you for that, and you might never remember that happening. But your body remembers, like your amygdala.
Your nervous system remembers.
Your nervous, your autonomic nervous system remembers. And so when your kid starts crying, you feel ashamed because it's a trigger for you, in the same way that a person who's been through, a traumatic assault might be triggered by a smell, or might be triggered by a certain song, or might be triggered by a certain location. You are triggered by crying because during the formative years of your life, when you heard crying coming out of your own mouth, the way that you felt immediately after that was shamed, which by the way, the opposite of shame is belonging. So when we talk about belonging, the opposite of shame is belonging, right? Shame is
that's the antidote. Yep.
Shame is saying, I don't know if I have a place in the pack. My place in the pack is insecure. So that's I think that's like you fundamental as a guy's like, I just don't like when kids cry. I'm not a baby person. It's like, yeah, well, maybe your parents weren't kind of treated you like they weren't a baby people when you were a baby.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's powerful. I mean, that's like
this is the work, man. This is the
100. Yeah.
This is the real work.
No, this is the stuff. This is the nitty gritty that we get into. And yeah, all those men that I work with too, when I get there, it's always rooted in some level of abandonment, rejection, shutting down. Every single one of them, not one of them I go to is, no, my parents comforted me and loved me and hugged me and said I was okay. Nope, that didn't exist. Not even in the slightest. So to close up, if you could leave, where can we find you? Yes. Where's your work? Anything else we need to know just to kind of get you?
Yeah. Best place to find me probably is on social media at Whole Parent with a W. The H one is not set up yet. WHOLEPARENT, Whole Parent. You'll find all the links in my bio are always just my email list. And that is because if you really want to do this work for real, that's where the work happens. The quick little mindset shift, it's fun, here's how you raise good siblings in a minute and 25 seconds on Instagram Reels or TikTok or whatever, sure. Like, it's all good and fun. My goal is to get you on my email list and maybe eventually to get you in the membership, but really to get you on the email list, because that's where we're going to go deep. And every Thursday I send out an email, usually over 1,000 words. Sometimes there's a video version of it that's embedded in there, but that is where, if you really want to do this work and start thinking differently and start parenting, not out of your default parenting, but actually out of your conscious, thoughtful, goals-driven, values-driven place, that's where you're going to get it from me.
Because the goal is what? For you, what is your goal?
I mean, I think I want my kids to be physically, this is what I say, I have to think about this, what this really means, because it's become almost rote for me at this point, but I want my kids to grow up to be physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually, and relationally healthy. I want them to be able to be healthy in all of those aspects of their life. Yeah. And I think if they're healthy in all those aspects of their life, they will be happy, but my goal is actually not their happiness. My goal is their fulfillment, because I think if they're fulfilled, then that's what happiness comes from. If you're healthy in all those ways, it's hard not to be happy. That's what I'll say.
Yeah. Boom. Oh, fire. Dude, thank you so much, Jon, for being on the show.
Thank you, Travis.
Everyone, everything's in the show notes. You'll see at the bottom of the links, everything we linked, all to Jon's stuff. You'll find it there. Just click in the description. It's all there for you to find it. Have a blessed day, dude. Looking forward to connecting again on the next podcast when you do, maybe your stuff and maybe the other whole parent thing. So
yeah, for sure.
All right, dude. Thanks, man.